We begin this Wednesday morning overseas. President Trump is attending the NATO summit in the Netherlands. His day began with a meeting with the NATO Secretary General as he lobbies member nations to spend more on defense. The president will meet with reporters later today before returning to the White House. This overseas visit comes as we learn more about those U.S. airstrikes on Iran's nuclear sites this past weekend. An initial assessment by the Defense Intelligence Agency concludes the strikes were not as effective as President Trump initially claimed they were. That's according to 3 people with knowledge of the report. The Trump administration is pushing back against that. Before heading to NATO yesterday, Mr. Trump accused Israel and Iran of violating a ceasefire that he announced between the two nations. That deal came just hours after Iran launched a retaliatory strike against a U.S. airbase in Qatar. As of now, the fragile ceasefire does appear to be holding. In a few moments, we're going to have the latest from overseas. We'll also have analysis from an expert on the region. But let's begin with NBC News correspondent Alice Barr, who joins us from Washington. Alice, good morning.
Good morning, Joe. And already this morning, we've heard from President Trump at the NATO summit, again asserting that Iran's nuclear program was totally obliterated and that he does not believe Iran would have had time to move equipment and uranium out before the U.S. strikes. He's dismissing new questions about the extent of the damage. President Trump at the NATO summit in the Netherlands with key allies touting a diplomatic win between 2 sworn enemies as a fragile ceasefire between Israel and Iran appears to be holding. Recounting in flight how he urged Israel's prime minister to back off a planned retaliatory strike. At the same time, there are new questions about how effective U.S. airstrikes on Iranian nuclear sites were, with a preliminary assessment by the U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency estimating Iran's nuclear program has been delayed by 3 to 6 months. That's according to 3 people with knowledge of the report. The White House calling that assessment flat out wrong. President Trump has repeatedly said Iran's nuclear capabilities were totally obliterated.
Iran will never rebuild its nuclear. From there, absolutely not. That place is under rock.
But one of the sources said core pieces remain intact. Questions also over what Iran may have moved from its nuclear sites before the U.S. strikes. Top Democrats in Congress accusing the Trump administration of misrepresenting the truth about the damage, questioning why the White House delayed planned briefings lawmakers have been demanding.
What are they running away from?
The head of the United Nations nuclear watchdog pointing to an important degree of visible damage.
The Iranian nuclear program has been set back significantly.
While acknowledging no one could fully assess the destruction underground at the key Fordo site, pressing Iran to resume diplomacy for a long-term solution. House Speaker Mike Johnson said his chamber would be briefed on Friday on Iran, with the Senate set to be briefed tomorrow. Joe?
All right, Alice, thank you so much. Let's bring in NBC News international correspondent Raf Sanchez. Raf, good morning. Let's pick it up right there with that initial assessment concluding U.S. airstrikes targeting Iran's nuclear enrichment sites this past weekend weren't as effective as President Trump initially said they were. We just heard there in Alice's piece, core pieces remain intact, according to those sources. What do we know about Iran's nuclear capabilities right now?
Joe, good morning. The short answer is there's a lot we don't know, and there are a number of major unanswered questions. The first is the obvious one. How much damage was actually done to these 3 core nuclear facilities? You're looking at the aftermath of those enormous bunker buster bombs dropped on Fordo. That is the core of the Iranian nuclear program, but it is literally buried into a mountain. So these bombs are enormous, but satellites do not tell us what has happened under the surface there. Has the facility actually been destroyed? Has there been just superficial damage to the top of the mountain? Is the answer somewhere in between? We don't know, and it may be some time before we get answers to that. The other big outstanding question, Joe, is what has happened to Iran's stockpile of highly enriched uranium? We know that they had about 900 pounds of uranium enriched to 60% purity. That's not enriched enough for bomb grade, but it's not far off. And we simply do not know where that material is right now. 900 pounds, not a lot of it. It's easily transportable in metal containers. There are some reports that the Iranians moved it out of the Isfahan site before those American cruise missiles hit their targets. So until we get those answers, it's very, very difficult to calculate the big question, which is how far are the Iranians from a bomb? And it's worth saying, Joe, that U.S. intelligence found before this strike there was no indication Iran's leadership had made a decision to rush for a bomb. The other big question is, have their intentions changed? Have they decided after this American attack that they do, in fact, need a weapon to deter future strikes?
Raf, let's talk about the ceasefire between Iran and Israel. It does appear to be holding right now, despite President Trump saying yesterday both nations had violated it. Where do things stand right now between the countries, and what are the challenges in the way?
Yeah, so Joe, when we were speaking 24 hours ago, this ceasefire was looking extremely shaky. It does appear to be holding. You saw President Trump on his way to the NATO summit very firmly admonishing both Iran and Israel not to violate this deal. And it does seem that so far they're sticking to it. Both sides in their own ways have declared victory. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu on the right of your screen saying that this was a victory that will reverberate for generations. The Iranians are saying, look, they withstood a joint assault by both the United States and Israel, and their government is still standing, which is victory in and of itself. It's worth saying, Joe, both sides have incentives for this war to come to an end. For Israel, they've had ballistic missiles crashing down. Their airspace has been closed. The economy shut down. So as much as they are touting this as a victory, Prime Minister Netanyahu may have wanted this to come to an end. And for Iran, you know, this was a potentially regime-destroying event for them, and just the fact that they are still standing at the end will be some comfort for the Ayatollah.
There are also some questions now, Raf, about Israel's military. The U.S. has helped defend Israel against Iranian attacks, we know, over the last couple of weeks. But now it's been reported Israel's military is running low on some key weaponry. That is according to 3 U.S. officials. What more can you tell us about what we're learning?
Yeah, remember, so Israel has been fighting Iran in this hot war for 12 days, but it has been fighting since October 7th, more than a year and a half ago. It's been dropping a huge number of bombs, not just in Iran, but also in Gaza, in Lebanon, in Yemen. And it has been using an enormous number of those missile interceptors to stop rockets and ballistic missiles that have been incoming into Israel. Israel is not a big country. It doesn't have a huge domestic production base. And there are real questions right now about how many of those missile interceptors Israel has left and how long they could continue fighting at this pace.
Right. Raf Sanchez. Raf, thank you so much. For more perspective on this ceasefire, let's bring in Alex Vatanka. He is a senior fellow at the Middle East Institute specializing in Iran. Alex, good to have you with us. So we saw a lot of back and forth yesterday shortly after the ceasefire was announced. It culminated in those strong words from President Trump. He literally used an expletive while speaking with reporters, accusing both Israel and Iran of violating the agreement. What do you think moved the needle for each side to commit to this deal and have it at least hold for the past 24 hours?
Great to be with you. Look, I mean, from the Iranian perspective, you could tell by listening to official statements from Tehran, pretty much from get-go, that they wanted this war to come to an end. Because frankly, they had been taken by surprise. They were getting ready for a protracted diplomatic track, potentially, and then yet suddenly on the 13th of June, they were hit. So they weren't ready for this war, and they've certainly never been preparing for such an intense campaign as we've witnessed by Israel, United States. So Iran wanted a ceasefire from get-go. United States, as soon as, sort of, if you will, the Trump administration says that diplomatic efforts had been exhausted and took out those 3 nuclear sites, we heard from the Trump White House saying now it's time for peace. Israel's position, that's the one probably most debated. Are the Israelis happy now? The nuclear sites have been taken out, at least for now, or was Israel's end game essentially regime change? Because if it was regime change Israel wanted, well, we're not at a regime change point yet, if that ever comes around the corner. So the question is, what brought Israel to agree to the ceasefire? And I can only assume President Trump spoke to them forcefully and said, look, you'll be on your own without us. And the Israelis recognized they couldn't be in this fight with Iran long-term without the United States, and they too agreed to the ceasefire.
You know, the Middle East region is known for forever wars where tensions between countries could escalate at any moment. This ceasefire, do you think it's going to hold? Will it last long-term?
Impossible to say, really, because, we have to look at the bigger context here. We just, Raf, your correspondent, just pointed out, this is a campaign, a conflict going back to 1979, essentially, with the Iranian Revolution. So much of this is about politics. It's not about nuclear capabilities of what Iran has or the military capabilities of Israel. Look, the Israelis can't bring the Iranian regime down militarily. So the best way forward to preserve this ceasefire, or make it stronger, if you will, and create a roadmap going forward, those are all political questions, not military ones. So that's where we're have to wait and see. I watch what the Iranians are doing. There seems to be a debate brewing of sorts in terms of how they got into this conflict in the first place and how they can prevent another one. But I don't really know if that fight between the hardliners and so-called moderates, who wins that one in Tehran. And obviously, we also have to take into account what U.S. and Israel's next steps will be, and that will obviously be shaped what the Iranians will do.
I want to ask you more about what we've been discussing just moments ago this morning. Those reports, sources familiar with early assessment of the damage from those U.S. strikes on Iran's nuclear sites say set back the program for several months. That's far from the total obliteration President Trump claimed earlier this week. Are you surprised by that assessment? I mean, given what we know about Iran's nuclear program, the ability to move and hide nuclear material, was this a situation that was ever going to be solved with one bombing mission?
Of all the nuclear crises we've seen in recent decades, certainly the ones involving Israel, say in Iraq in 81, in Syria 2007, when they successfully ended those countries' nuclear programs, this is a very different beast, if you will. Iran's nuclear program is scattered across a country the size of Alaska, over 2 dozen probably nuclear sites, and probably sites that we don't know of. So the idea that one military mission from above, without boots on the ground, will bring it to an end was always far-fetched. But I mean, obviously, in terms of the main sites, damage has been brought. I can't sit here from Washington and tell you exactly what is happening inside that mountain in terms of damage. But what I can tell you is if politically the Iranians decide the lesson they take from this attack by the United States is actually to have a nuclear weapon, they have the technician, they have the resources, and they have to some extent some support from the Russians, the Chinese, and others to do it. A high-risk strategy on their part. I hope they're going to come back and talk to the Trump administration, look for a diplomatic solution, but they might make another decision that for their own security, weaponizing what's left of the nuclear program is the best way forward for them.
All right. Alex Vatanka, appreciate your expertise. Thanks for joining us this morning. Here in New York, Zohran Mamdani, a relative political newcomer, is on course to become the Democratic Party's nominee for city mayor. He declared victory in yesterday's primary election. It is a stunning upset and a rebuke of the party establishment. After all, Mamdani is a progressive state assemblyman, a Democratic socialist. He took a commanding lead after first-choice votes were tallied, beating his nearest rival, former New York Governor Andrew Cuomo. Cuomo had been the frontrunner throughout the campaign, but conceded the election last night as those results came in. We don't expect to get the final results until next week. That's because New York uses ranked choice voting, which does take longer to tally. NBC News Capitol Hill correspondent Melanie Zanona joins us now to talk more about this. So, Mel, Mamdani, virtually unknown when this contest began, at least beyond where he represented in New York, he has surged in the past few weeks. How did he manage to pull off this surprise victory? What did he have to say last night?
Yeah, this was a political earthquake for a number of reasons. He is a relative newcomer. He's young. He's a Democratic socialist. But the way he was able to pull off a victory is through both the style and substance of his campaign. On style, he ran a really modern campaign. You saw him teaming up with influencers and doing these viral social media clips. Very different than Andrew Cuomo, for example, who ran a much more traditional establishment campaign, relying on endorsements and unions and big money. And then on the substance, he ran on things like free childcare, free buses, city-run groceries, freezes on rent. And he also really leaned into the desire in the Democratic Party, particularly in the base right now, to see some change, to shake up the status quo, and to lean into the fight with Donald Trump. Here's what he had to say last night.
The mayor will use their power to reject Donald Trump's fascism, to stop mass ICE agents from deporting our neighbors, to govern our city as a model for the Democratic Party, a party where we fight for working people with no apology. A life of dignity should not be reserved for a fortunate few. It should be one that city government guarantees for each and every New Yorker.
And that is a very different tone than the current mayor, Eric Adams, who has really tried to partner with the Trump administration, try to curry favor with the Trump administration. And we should also point out that the DOJ did drop its corruption case against Adams, who is now running as an independent this fall.
What did we hear from Andrew Cuomo during his concession speech? And where does this leave the former New York governor's attempt at a political comeback? I mean, could he still decide to run in the general election?
Yeah, he absolutely could. We were looking for clues in his concession speech last night about his plans. He was very gracious in conceit. He complimented the Assemblyman, even though he'd grown very bitter in the final days and the closing days of the campaign. He had nothing but nice things to say about Mamdani, said it's his night and he ran a great campaign. He did not sound committed, though, to running as an independent in the general election. He said they're going to take some look at the tally because they still need to tally up the ranked choice voting, and they're going to make some tough decisions. So not totally on board just yet. It is still a possibility, but just unclear at this moment what this means for the Cuomo political comeback.
And Mel, many people saw this election as an indicator of where voters want to see the Democratic Party headed next, either to the middle or to the left. Is the message here for the party to move toward a more progressive direction, and just what's been the broader reaction from Democrats?
Yeah, so obviously Democrats have been wrestling with that exact question, Joe, since the crushing November election. They've been debating whether they need to move more to the center to try to appeal to moderates and independents who fled the party, or if they need to pursue more radical policies as the only foil to the radical and extreme policies on the right. New York City, obviously a very blue, very liberal city, so I'm not sure that other battleground places are going to necessarily be looking to replicate the Democratic Socialist platform and playbook that we saw from Mamdani. But I will say, if there's one thing that Democrats may try to take away from what we saw last night, and I've already heard this from a few Democrats that I was checking in with after this election victory last night, is that he ran relentlessly on free items, on the cost of living, on bringing down the cost of living for everyday Americans. So that is certainly something that Democrats might try to replicate in future elections.
And of course, we'll have a better gauge of perhaps where things are when we have the general election later this year with Eric Adams on the ballot there. Melanie, thank you so much. Appreciate it. Millions of Americans are hoping Mother Nature will turn the thermostat down at least a little today, but this blistering, unrelenting heat wave is not over yet. 124 million people are expected to be under heat alerts today. On Tuesday, triple-digit temperatures during yesterday's peak set daily records in cities like Boston and New York. Well, the worst of it may be behind us. You can still expect to see even more record highs today, all up and down the East Coast. NBC News correspondent Sam Brock has more on how people are coping with this summer swelter.
A triple-digit heat wave is hammering people in some of the nation's largest cities. From New York.
We left Florida. We came north to get away from the heat.
And it's worse here.
And it's worse here.
To the nation's capital, where the Washington Monument remains closed for a second straight day.
It's the feeling of like walking into an oven.
It is really hot.
The summer's first blistering stretch also prompting a very high heat risk at the Grand Canyon and turning deadly. Officials in St. Anne, Missouri confirming a woman dying in her house due to dangerous heat after having no water or air conditioning for at least 3 days. While in Massachusetts, 2 firefighters hospitalized after suffering heat exhaustion, battling flames. As many parts of the East Coast have had to cope with power outages. At its peak, tens of thousands in the region losing access to AC.
A second ago, you pulled up your phone. What did it show?
100 degrees.
So we have hit triple digits here.
Yes.
Yes.
And you guys have what right now? Or what don't you have at this hour?
No electricity.
Donna Masucci and her Roselle Park, New Jersey neighbor Jay Boff are relying on a generator with no power since midnight. At the same time, they can handle the electricity limbo.
The more elderly, older people that have medical conditions, the ones that need to run equipment for their health.
That would be top of mind in a situation like this.
Sure. Concern elevated in public spaces, too. At least 5 people needed treatment from heat-related injuries after a K-pop concert in D.C. And a Northeast Transportation bedrock, Amtrak, announcing temperature-related speed restrictions from 11 a.m. to 8 p.m. Some speed bumps, as some relief could be in store later in the week, though it's little comfort to those suffering through the suffocating heat now. Sam Brock, NBC News.
And the sizzling summer heat continues today, so let's get a check on how long it's going to stick around with meteorologist Michelle Grossman. Michelle, good morning.
Good morning, Joe. And the good news is relief is on the way. Not today, though. We're looking at temperatures still above normal. Yesterday was a peak of the heat. We broke so many records yesterday, so many records on Monday. We're going to break more records today, and then this should be the last of it before we start to see that relief. So still 124 million people under heat alerts. We have heat advisories in the orange, excessive extreme heat warnings in the pink. That includes places like Norfolk, Raleigh, also Charleston, West Virginia, and Pittsburgh. We will once again see temperatures well above normal, but this is the good news. We have this big area of high pressure. It's a cool Canadian high pressure. That's going to start to sink to the south. Today, we still have that heat dome tacked in place. We've been talking about this heat dome for days. Unfortunately, it's tacked, but it's going to start to be on the move later on today. And then there's that boundary that's going to separate us between that cooler air and that warmer air. So as we go throughout the day, there's that slow retreat of that heat dome, that Canadian high moving further to the south. And we're going to see cooler temperatures in the extreme portions of northern New England and also the Gulf Coast states, but the big relief comes tomorrow. Today, this is what it looks like. Burlington, Vermont, we're looking at 83. That's better than where they have been. 89, still warm in Boston. You factor in the heat, it's going to feel warmer in some places. It's going to feel warmer in New York City. It will feel like 100 degrees. That's what you want to dress for as you head out. 90s in D.C., Pittsburgh, Charleston, West Virginia, also in Indianapolis. But look what happens tomorrow. There's that boundary sinking to the south, that big area of high pressure, that Canadian high pressure, kind of takes hold. That clockwise direction brings that cooler air off the ocean. So we're going to see cooler temperatures tomorrow. It's going to feel really nice in New York City, 79 degrees tomorrow. That's 18 degrees colder than where we have been. So temperatures plummeting 10 to 20 degrees. And notice all those 70s compared to 90s and 100s. We're looking at 78 degrees in Buffalo, 74 in Albany, 84 in Scranton, and 72 in portions of New England. So south of this, we're still sizzling. We're looking at temperatures in D.C. Tomorrow, 94. It's really kind of where you are. It's all about location. And we're looking at temperatures still in the 90s as we head further to the south. But that's more expected, right?
Yeah.
These temperatures to the south, we're getting back to normal in portions of the Mid-Atlantic and New England and the Northeast.
I'm glad we're above the line.
Yeah,
that line, whatever it is, I'm glad
yes.
I'm above it right now.
Me
Michelle,
too.
thank you so much.
Sure.
A crew of 4 international astronauts launched into orbit early this morning on the maiden voyage of a brand new SpaceX Dragon capsule. The launch of a Falcon 9 rocket pierced the night sky around 2:30 this morning from NASA's Kennedy Space Center in Florida. It's the 4th mission by commercial space company Axiom Space. They work with SpaceX and NASA to bring private crews to the International Space Station. Axiom Mission 4 is expected to dock to the ISS lab tomorrow morning, where the crew will conduct nearly 60 experiments over the course of 2 weeks. On board is former NASA chief astronaut Peggy Whitson and 3 new astronauts from India, Poland, and Hungary. They're also the first people in space from those respective countries. We'll be keeping an eye on their journey.
We thank you for watching, and remember, stay updated on breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or watch live on our YouTube channel.